Happy Halloween, everybody, provided you're watching this on one specific day of the year. Halloween is a very special time for me, and for one reason. I fucking hate it. I've never gotten the point of going to haunted houses or doing anything more than just dressing up and getting hammered with your friends. But one part of this time of the year that I just can't seem to avoid is getting the itch to play through some classic horror games. That and Count Chocula, which is only sold for like a month. Now, I made a video way earlier on my channel about the world of awful horror games where I researched some of the lowest rated horror games of all time, and in that video I said I'd make a video about the opposite of that. A massive problem between me and horror games though is that as much as I love the idea of horror games, I've kinda had to come to terms with the fact that I'm a bit of a pussy and I'm easily frightened, making me either the best or the worst possible person to watch play a horror game. With the video on shitty horror games, those video games were so fucking bad I never had to deal with anything scary. But these good horror games scared the fucking shit out of me. Horror as a genre is all or nothing. Horror games either land themselves in the realm of mediocrity along the likes of Resident Evil 6, or they perfect the genre and become fan favorites up there with Silent Hill and the original Resident Evil. Today we're going to be going through many of the highest critically acclaimed horror games ever made, and I want to answer one major question I've had. What is it that makes a horror game great? And if there's any way to find out, it's through these games. But please, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present the world of amazing horror games. Before we hop into the first two games, I want to once again outline this video as well as clear up a little confusion before we get into the thick of it. Firstly, I need to define what qualifies as a horror game because the comment section on my older video was very confused. To be a horror game, horror needs to be the primary aspect of the game over everything else. There are plenty of games out there that have horror aspects and creepy environments that just straight up aren't horror games. Resident Evil 3 is a horror game. Resident Evil 5 and 6 are not. The Last of Us is not a horror game. And most importantly, Bloodborne is not a fucking horror game. Yes, Bloodborne has some creepy environments towards the start, but never once does the game indulge in that. The focus is always on the game's vague story and the amazing boss designs that make the game almost flawless. I mean, be honest with me here, did Bloodborne really scare you? Bloodborne is a 10 out of 10 game, but it is not a horror game. Lastly, I want to give some honorable mentions before we get started because there's a lot of games I had to pick from, and each of them had to be avoided for a variety of reasons. First up is Dead by Daylight, a game that I have a ton of passion for that I went back and forth on for hours debating whether or not to include this game, and I decided against it. This is sort of a horror game, but really for new players only. Being an online party game, it makes sense that this really isn't horror, but I think at one point in its history, it definitely was. But if you're a fan of horror games and movies, this is a fucking goldmine for you regardless of whether or not it scares you. The DLC characters range from the Xenomorph recently to Pinhead from the Hellraiser franchise, Michael Myers, Leatherface. Most likely, if you're a fan of a horror franchise, there's a character here for you. So if for some reason you've never played DBD, give it a try, it's a fucking blast. Just don't try and be a competitive player, it's not fun. The next game I chose to avoid was Five Nights at Freddy's, and I'm sure I don't really need to explain this one too much. This game was a fucking horror staple, but retrospectively, it's pretty goddamn lame, and it really only thrived on its jump scares, making for really good YouTube reactions. Our last honorable mention is the original Outlast, if only for the impact this game had on the genre as a whole. The whole seeing things through a camera thing doesn't really do it for me, and the game's humor is a bit immature for my taste, but I do respect what this game did for the genre as a whole, despite me not really being much of a fan. Alright, that's all I had to say. Let's hop into the 10 greatest horror games of all time. Alien is the second best horror movie ever made. I'll fucking say it, Alien 1 is much better than 2. The only horror movie I'd ever say tops the original Alien is John Carpenter's The Thing, which also got a video game I covered in my Awful Horror Games video. But Alien Isolation is no joke, one of the best games I've ever played in my entire life, and spoiler alert, arguably the best fucking game in this entire video. Alien Isolation was developed and released by Creative Assembly in 2014 to mostly universal praise. This was the first well-made Alien video game ever. Just 1 year prior to this, the infamous Aliens Colonial Marines release is one of the first major instances of false advertising in a video game, and to try again at an Alien game just a year later, it's pretty understandable why so many people were so skeptical of this game. Alien Isolation takes place right in between Alien and Aliens and follows Ripley's daughter, Amanda Ripley, who's simply referred to as Ripley to keep the feel of the original films. Keeping the vibe and experience of the original movie specifically is what Alien Isolation excels at more than anything else, making you truly feel hunted by the Xenomorph throughout your entire experience. The game also recreates a lot of classic scenes from the original film, like the waking up from hypersleep. The ship itself resembles the Nostromo almost perfectly. And quick side rant, I fucking hate that the people who created the Alien franchise explain that everything in the movie is extremely phallic on purpose. The Xenomorph was inspired by a literal cock and balls, the Nostromo in the cave in the movie is designed to represent the insides of a human being, Ripley gets sexually assaulted, it's fucking weird. This is something I repress regularly. Alien Isolation's main event takes place on the Sevastopol, a trading center that's been ravaged by the time we get to it, meaning everything's broken and the few people alive are fucking insane. I won't bore you with the the specifics of the story because for some reason, if you haven't played through this game, I don't want to ruin it for you, but I will talk in depth about the gameplay. The game gives you a good handful of weapons, but this is really only useful against the humans you'll come across in your playthrough. The game's combat itself is focused primarily on stealth, making a good portion of the combat technically optional, but if you do decide to indulge, it's very reminiscent of The Last of Us, being primarily focused on making minimal noise when you need to be stealthy and making a lot of noise when you need a distraction. One of the things this game does perfectly is psychological horror. Being an Alien game, the game knows exactly what you came for and carefully holds its hand until it's the right time to play the Xenomorph card. The first hour or so of your playthrough is spent navigating through a relatively vacant part of the Sevastopol, and the game implements a perfect amount of alien noises to keep you on your toes while not throwing it in your face. Just enough to surprise the fuck out of you when he does eventually show up out of nowhere. This game made me on more than one occasion audibly say holy fucking shit, which is very rare for a game of this type. The alien has an iconic first appearance dropping out of a vent in an oddly graceful way before exiting the room, signifying that the game is finally getting serious. As much as I expected the Xenomorph to be in the area hunting you to happen way later on my way back to finish out level 1, I looked over to my left and almost fucking lost it. The Xenomorph has one of the best monster AIs in a video game to date that will hunt you down and make you scared for your life. Any and all noise you make alerts the alien. The radar you have also makes noise that alerts the alien, meaning you need to occasionally leave yourself completely in the dark. There's even an open mic part of the game that allows the alien to track you down if you make a loud noise in real life.
That was fucking close. No, I fucking didn't. No!
It's one of the single coolest experiences in any game I've ever played, but this isn't the type of horror that makes you hesitant to push forward. For me, this is just a giant adrenaline rush, and being cornered by the alien is exactly what I'm playing this game for. One thing I do need to chip the game for is that sometimes it is a little unintuitive. The biggest occurrence of this that got under my skin was during your second run-in with the Xenomorph. This is one of the scariest parts of the entire game, as hiding isn't really much of an option because no matter what, you'll eventually need to sneak by him. Prior to this though, the game introduces you to a doctor who offers his help if we can get him some access to some medical supplies and more importantly a keycard. But once you have this keycard, the game just tells you to go back to the doctor, and once you're there, he will just sit there and stare at you and say nothing. The problem here is mainly that the Xenomorph can and will come into this room whether or not you're prepared, meaning that this game is just sitting there cooking you after you completed the objective that it gave you, which can and will get you killed. Overall, Alien Isolation is the pinnacle of licensed horror games, and it gives homages to the original titles while not being afraid to do its own thing, all while keeping the series' identity intact. Being an older game now, you can frequently find this game on an excellent sale, and if you do, just buy the fucking game, experience this at 12 AM with the lights off and a headset. 10 out of 10 experience. Resident Evil 1 Remastered, probably one of the best remasters of all time that brought the honestly kinda dogshit Resident Evil 1 into the latest and greatest GameCube and received critical acclaim as the best game in the entire series among critics. And while the game sold pretty well, a lot of Capcom executives thought that the game underperformed, something that I think led to Capcom switching the series to a more action-oriented experience with Resi 4. This is more or less the final true horror game in Resident Evil's franchise, until 7 that is, and I admittedly have kinda mixed feelings on this game. In terms of creating the perfect survival horror environment, this game fucking kills it, but even at the time, the controls were absolutely horrible and the game story is as bland as it gets. And yes, I know the control thing was kind of intentional, I'll get to that. The game allows you to pick a character between Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. They both have different campaigns, mainly just being a few arsenal changes. Chris has more HP while Jill has access to a lockpick and more item slots. I picked Jill for my gameplay footage, if only because I like Resident Evil 3, the original that is. Resident Evil, just like the first 3 games, is a top-down third-person shooter with a fixed camera, something that the series was known for at the time, and it aged extremely poorly. The changes in camera angles are completely fine if you're expecting them, but if you're running from a zombie and the camera angle completely changes and you're trying to figure out where the fuck to go, it gets very annoying. Not to mention that turning around in this game takes forever. All of this makes for some of the most clunky controls I've ever had to manage in a video game. But as I mentioned earlier, the common defense for this was that it was intentional. The idea here is that a game with extremely fluid movement makes the player confident in their abilities to deal with their surrounding threats. And by taking that away, especially in a cramped corridor environment, the player feels more threatened and less capable to take on the many threats the game throws at you. But regardless of whether or not this was intentional, I think this is taking it a step too far and it gets on my fucking nerves. But outside of those major complaints, this game does horror flawlessly. Our game starts with the STARS team, which is basically SWAT in this world, being called in to investigate the disappearance of one of the other STARS teams around the Spencer Mansion. Upon finding the wreckage, our core cast of characters get attacked by dogs, and this is where the game's campaigns diverge. For us on Jill's side, Wesker, Jill, and Barry make it into the mansion and decide to investigate everything around them, which gets us into the gameplay. If there's anything this game excels at, it's iconic moments. My favorite is the awesome first zombie encounter you have that the Resident Evil movie from a few years back replicated perfectly, even though that movie was complete horseshit. it. After discovering both that zombies exist and they're in the mansion, Barry has the genius idea of splitting up, which definitely has no negative consequences. Gameplay actually starts from this point forward, and it's classic Resident Evil. Sprawling environments with locked doors, puzzles, and shambling zombies. When it comes to horror games, I'm a huge fan of games that exclusively take place in one environment that you slowly comb your way through, unlocking secrets and solving puzzles that you found far earlier on in your playthrough. And that's something that this game perfected. By selecting an item in your inventory and hitting examine, certain key items can be altered to unlock a different purpose. The first main puzzle the game throws at you is in the graveyard that has a massive stone with an engraving of Cupid. However, his arrow tip is missing, meaning one thing: you'll need to find the replacement. After exploring the second level, you'll come across a gold arrow. Examining this allows us to detach the arrowhead, allowing us access to the crypt and a cursed book, which when examined gives us a key to further explore the mansion with, alongside giving us warning about evil. The crypt is also home to a long-term objective, which is filling in the 4 missing masks on the walls. These masks are found throughout the mansion, which you'll need to run over to the crypt upon acquiring. These loosen the chains holding up the coffin, which we'll get to in a minute. After progressing through the mansion, you'll find another member of SARS who's been pretty fucked up. He blames it on a large poisonous snake and tasks us with finding a serum to get him back up and running. After doing so, we get our first boss fight against the aforementioned big snake, who is definitely wide but like disproportionately short. The meta with most of these bosses are to use your heavy weapons like shotguns and grenades, and for the most part, at least this stage of the boss goes down pretty fucking quickly. That is until he suddenly comes back and almost kills Jill, and instead eats the other STARS member whose name I already forgot, admittedly. The snake, which I later found out to be named fucking Yawn of all names, takes a little bit more damage before hauling ass. The final real change in gameplay you'll encounter comes after you found the 4th and final mask. This completely knocks off the 4th and final chain from the coffin, revealing a still living inhabitant, and he looks a little bit more lively than your average zombie. These guys are called Crimson Heads, and to give you an understanding of these guys, just imagine a mix between Walmart shoppers and that strange ROTC kid at your school. After killing the first Crimson Head, a major change happens in the entire mansion, where the zombies that died that still have their head intact are slowly going to transform into Crimson Heads, meaning that the mansion is going to get a hell of a lot more dangerous. To prevent a zombie from turning into a Crimson Head, we can use a lighter with kerosene to burn a corpse to prevent them from coming back, but your supply of kerosene is quite limited, meaning you'll need to choose these bodies carefully. After that, the gameplay loop essentially remains the exact same. I don't really want to talk too much in depth about this game because seeing it for your first time on your own is something that should not be spoiled. Another type of enemy called hunters start showing up to ruin your day, there's a cool shark, and I really won't say much more. So if you haven't played this game, go play it. Luigi's fucking Mansion. Yeah, I know after that long-ass explanation about what is and isn't a horror game, I'm gonna get shit on for this, but I love this game way too much not to talk about it. And in a lot of ways, I would argue that this is a kid's horror game and it does deserve a spot on this list. But I'm sure plenty of you will disagree no matter what I say. Luigi's Mansion released all the way back in September of 2001, and specifically 3 days after a specific incident. Many people consider this game to be one of the boldest decisions Nintendo made in its history. The largest gap in mainline Mario games occurred right between Super Mario 64 and Sunshine, which released in 2002. Meaning for one full year, Nintendo chose this game to represent the Mario franchise for the GameCube launch as opposed to a mainline title. The game only reached about half the sales that Sunshine would turn out, but both games stand on equal footing in terms of quality, at least in my opinion. But you might be asking, why choose this game over the other sequels, since they basically smoked this game critically? Well, to be honest, I'm gonna piss some people off. Luigi's Mansion 3 has some great moments, but is seriously mediocre at everything it needs to do in my opinion. The atmosphere is really anything but spooky, and the combat is just an easier version of Dark Moon's. The puzzles here are solid overall, and Luigi is a fine addition to the formula, but if you don't get the spooky ghost hunting right, then you're missing the point of the whole series. As far as Dark Moon goes, I actually probably played that game a lot more than I did the original title, and I do love that game, but for a lot of different reasons. I just don't think it can compare to the original game. Maybe it's a graphical bias and the upcoming Switch re-release will fix this, but knowing Nintendo, probably not. At the end of the day, I think the original title will always be the definitive Luigi's Mansion. Let's start up a fresh save file and get started. The game opens to a moody cinematic of Luigi walking up to a mansion he won in a contest he never entered. Mario also arrived here before the homeowner did and went missing. I don't know, the story is not really important. While it's nothing today, the attention to detail in the sequence is fantastic. From his jittery walk animation to his hand trembling when he's opening a door Resident Evil style, it's all fantastic. And after getting jumped by a ghost, we meet Professor Egad, who also gets his shit kicked in, prompting him to immediately retire and volunteer us to take over. The combat in this game is definitely its strangest aspect, and one that was understandably built upon in its sequels. Here, ghosts will approach you, and to take them out, you're gonna need to stun them with a flashlight and expose their heart just like in the real world. From here, all you need to do is take the vacuum and use the power of... The ghost will try to get away from you, but you essentially need to mirror its inputs in the opposite direction to keep yourself directly in line with them. This is pretty tough for me, and I'm not gonna lie, I am not good with this game's combat. However, what makes this game so great in my opinion is the Resident Evil style exploration. Most of the game admittedly revolves around you going from room to room and clearing ghosts, which when completed makes the room brighten up and more often than not reward you with a key, leading to this iconic jingle. more often than not, most of what you're going to be doing is getting keys, then checking your map to figure out where you need to go next, but more importantly, hopefully finding a portrait ghost. Portrait ghosts are probably the most memorable part of the game for people and are essentially just glorified puzzles. The typical formula for this is that you're going to walk into a suspicious room and eventually see a portrait ghost sitting around and doing something, but they're immune to your flashlight, meaning you need to search the room to find the weakness. This can range from properly answering music trivia questions to opening a curtain to extinguish a flame, or just murdering a dog's owner and using their bones to distract it. You know, just an average Tuesday for Luigi. Once you're through an area's portrait ghost though, you're going to be faced with a boss fight which I'm admittedly 50-50 on. Strangely enough, an overwhelming majority of these involve you shooting something back at the boss you're going against, and I've always felt they could have done more with these. There's Chauncey, who throws rocking horses at you for minimal damage before throwing bouncy balls that you can shoot back at him, making him vulnerable. The next boss you encounter in a crypt roughly follows this exact same formula, except it's summonable ghosts, and it's at this point that the game runs into a brick fucking wall. The single largest complaint viewers, including myself, have with this game is that despite its insanely short runtime, it managed to become tedious about halfway through the game. The first and foremost reason for this is that the game comes up with the brilliant idea of spreading 50 boos across the mansion about halfway through the game. You only need to capture 40 of these to progress through the game, but unless you experience this for yourself, you have no idea how miserable this is. Essentially, any random room you enter has a good chance of having a boo in it, but it hides in a random piece of furniture indicated by your boo radar. Once you expose the boo, you absolutely need to capture it quickly, because if you wait too long, they can just go straight through wall into another room. This might sound fine, but when you're chasing boos and one goes into a room that you need to walk all the way around the mansion for, it starts to get a little fucking annoying. Or better yet, it can just go into a locked room, meaning you're just kinda fucked. I don't feel like doing this shit, but I gotta finish this game somehow. When looking at Luigi's Mansion from an outside perspective, or even playing it casually, the game honestly looks and feels very well made, but while the casual playthrough of the game is maybe 5 hours, the speedrun is 7 minutes. While I was sitting here writing the script, I thought I would maybe learn how to speedrun this game, but no, I'm good. I'm just gonna leave it to the pros and try my best to explain it. My explanation is gonna be pretty brief, but if you're interested in speedrunning in general, there is an excellent video I'm gonna link called How Speedrunners Broke Luigi's Mansion. It is a fantastic watch. The single coolest glitch for me personally is the out-of-bounds shit that happens right after Chauncey's boss fight. Using some strange collision with bats and the C-stick to skew Luigi's angle, you can actually clip through most of the walls and essentially skip like 90% of the game, making it a short but sweet speedrun. Like I said, go watch Lunatic J's video on the subject. It's a great watch, but let's move on to game number 4. System Shock 2, probably the least popular game on this list, and it's certainly one I'd never played prior to this. So what is System Shock? Well, System Shock is a first-person survival horror franchise that released in the late 90s, and in terms of gameplay, this was BioShock before BioShock existed. So why am I not starting with one, or hell, even the remaster of one that just came out? Well, since I'd never played these games, I figured I would just play the highest critically acclaimed version, and since I had no personal input, the highest scored title in the series is System Shock 2, so I picked that one. Should I have started with one? Story-wise, probably, but I made sure I got myself up to date enough to play this game. Now, I know this will inevitably lead back to the arguments about what exactly qualifies as a horror game, because admittedly, I wasn't quite sure if I was even playing one. I actually also had this issue with BioShock, another game I really considered putting in this video, but I think it's fair to say that these games are probably considered horror games. The enemies are clearly intended to be frightening, many of them are disfigured, there's a lot of corpses and blood, but it's kinda hard to say because the graphics are so outdated that it can make a lot of this a lot less scary. But considering the remaster, the original System Shock tried so hard to include horror elements, I think it's fair to say that this was supposed to be horror as well. The game puts a lot of emphasis on the RPG elements with 10 upgradable skills and multiple branching paths on how you upgrade them. The beginning of the game allows us to choose a branch of the military to enlist in, each specializing in a specific skill set. Marines have the best combat skills, Navy has a lot of tech benefits, and OSI has the most benefits for a skill set called PSI, which is essentially just this game's version of plasmids and vigors. I personally opted for the Marine route since I'm a newer player, and that tends to be the most simple route. The game's opening sequence involves us waking from cryosleep in the game's primary setting, the Von Braun, and immediately all hell breaks loose as there's all kinds of shit exploding and we're left to search around for an explanation while completing the game's objectives. While you're doing so, you'll regularly get bum rushed by these dudes with metal pipes you'll need to fight through the game's admittedly janky combat. It works exactly how it looks, and the extremely slow swinging of the pipe makes this very awkward. Not to mention, sometimes the enemy can just ignore the stun of getting hit and damage you anyway. But where dying in most horror games means reloading a previous save, in System Shock 2 it only uses a small amount of the in-game currency to restructure your body at the available areas. And since dying is not a hugely penalized thing, the game does not make your life easy. There are areas with infinitely respawning enemies, turrets to pin you down, cameras that send a bunch of enemies to kill you if you stay in the radius for too long, the list goes on and on. The way you approach the game is also heavily dependent on the skills you have. For example, if you put all of your upgrade modules into the repair skill, you can acquire a broken shotgun pretty early into the game and fix it up, giving you a hell of an advantage. But to be completely honest with you, I really don't personally see in this game what a lot of other people do. I played a little over half of this game, and I really don't find this game to be quite as gripping as a lot of the other games on here. And maybe that's because I was going in here with the wrong mindset, expecting a lot of horror elements. I know there's a major gap in time between this and BioShock, but I think that's just an objectively better version of this formula. BioShock does everything this game does does with more memorable characters, enemies, and way better moody lighting. And if you consider BioShock to be a horror game, which is a very divisive topic, I would say it's the better game here. But I don't know whether or not to call it one. I was very confused on this. Don't blame me, man. I'm switching games. Silent Hill 2, a game no one should be surprised made it on here, and it's one of the most impactful games the horror genre has ever seen, being relevant over 20 years after its initial release. I have some hot takes when it comes to this game, but let me first say that this is genuinely one of the most creepy and unsettling games I've ever played, and manages to be a rare horror game that actually has a captivating story. Silent Hill 2 is a fantastic exploration of human psychology, especially the further into the game you get, which is a massively important story detail that I will not go particularly in-depth with whatsoever. The game follows our main protagonist, James Sunderfield, a man who's come to the town Silent Hill in search of his deceased wife who sent him a letter. That's all the game leaves you with for the better part of the game's opening as you explore the city of Silent Hill. This is where many of my hot takes come into play. The camera, movement, and combat are all very below average, even for a game of this type. In some areas the camera is fixed, in others it's a dynamic, moving thing. However, this game almost needs a free-moving camera to accommodate the many open environments and hidden items. Here, searching rooms can be confusing, and trying to remember which rooms you have and haven't entered gets very tiring. The movement in the game is also pretty annoying at times, feeling more clunky than anything else, but it really only becomes an issue with my final big gripe being the mediocre combat. The game features a few different weapons, but the first one you're going to get access to is a plank of wood to beat the shit out of the game's enemies with. The first enemies you encounter are called lying figures, and they essentially just slowly walk towards you and spit acid, but the game gives you zero instructions on how to deal with them. To fight in this game, you need to hold R2, which brings a weapon into the ready position, and then click X to use the weapon. This is pretty simple, but I have never played or heard of another game with these exact controls, and trying to figure this out on your own is so unnecessary. I'm assuming you were kind of intended to play and read the manual as you figured things out, but that's just kind of a reach, and it might sound sort of strange, but I get the feeling that this is one of those games that people hate when it's criticized, partially due to the nature of a very specific story element that would allow you to argue that a lot of these games' issues were actually genius design choices and the game is actually a perfect package. You know what? Fuck it, actually. I'm bringing up a very minor spoiler. I actually think it enhances the game if you know it going into it, but if you want to avoid it, I'm going to give you 5 seconds. So a very key component to Silent Hill's story is that all the monsters and everything that tries to kill you are actually manifestations of the negative emotions of James and all the other characters you meet, meaning that Silent Hill is essentially a town capable of bringing your worst fears to life and is essentially purgatory. This brings a beautiful retrospective look on every single place and enemy you encounter, how it relates to the character and the sins they committed, their psyche, their traumas. It's beautiful. It is a beautifully designed world when all of this is kept in mind. However, anytime elements in a game, show, or movie have this sort of track record for always having purpose behind everything they show, tend to get some of the worst type of fans. These are fans who refuse to let anything get criticized and make some of the craziest reaches to justify flaws. I'm just gonna say One Piece fans and leave it at that. Now that that rant's out of the way, let's get back to what this game does brilliantly. Your first main location you'll explore is a set of apartment complexes that have been abandoned. Similar to a lot of games of this style, we navigate looking for puzzles to solve, keys to find, cutscenes to trigger, and the game decides to completely tease you with its most iconic character. About 2 or so hours into the game, you'll come across the 3rd floor where a very interesting red-lit pyramid-wearing individual is just kind of staring you down. Knowing this fucker's in the building will make you think that you're gonna see him and that he's gonna chase you down. But no, the game knows you're thinking this and keeps all of his appearances incredibly sparse. And when you do find him, he's being a sexual deviant with mannequins, which is an extremely odd pacebreaker, but it does technically tie into the game's overall themes. Speaking of pacebreakers, these cutscenes are so bizarrely out of place, it almost seems like they were made before the game was and they just had to build around them. I'll give you a quick example, just watch.
Kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah. I'm looking for...
See how it randomly cut from a pre-rendered part into the game part? It's like I said, it's almost like the cutscenes were made on their own before the full script. Not only that, but the voice acting is so awful, it's almost impressive.
Excuse me,
Oh, I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to scare you.
This is easily the biggest issue the game has with immersion. After writing this script, I realized that this game impacted me way more than I thought it was going to, and honestly probably deserved its own video altogether in retrospect, so I'm just gonna kinda cut myself off here. Next Halloween, I am extremely tempted to make a video on every single Silent Hill game, so maybe look forward to that. In the meantime though, if you've never played Silent Hill, regardless if you played the original or if you even like horror games, play this fucking game. It is brilliant, and honestly, the game didn't outright scare me at any turn, but it was one of the most disturbing games on this list. Sorry for getting all video say on you for a minute, but let's move on to our next game. Hey everybody, Dagger from the future here once again, who hasn't warmed his voice up because I'm a lazy piece of shit. And somehow, miraculously, during the time I was editing this video, the fucking Silent Hill 2 remaster got announced, and I'm just losing my shit. I don't know why this always happens to me. Cool things always happen after I've written my script and recorded it, so, yeah, that's all I wanted to say. This shit is unbelievably hype, but back to the video. Dead Space 1. Not the remaster, but the original one that came out on PS3 and Xbox 360 and blew people's fucking minds on how new-gen consoles can handle far more flashy environments and better spatial audio. Dead Space 1 uses a very different type of horror than any of the other games on our list. A lot of the other games on this list rely on a large amount of psychological horror through slower-paced levels where you're intended to slowly wander your way throughout. Here it's almost the total opposite. Here you can walk through the levels at your own pace since you're pretty heavily armed. Dead Space, more than any other game in this video, focuses on body horror and gore to scare the player more than the inability to fight back, and it does not hesitate to swarm the player with tons of mangled, resurrected creatures to make you panic and hesitate. The plot for the game starts in the distant future of 2508, where humans have become nearly extinct on Earth and as a result seek resources on other planets instead. Our story follows an engineer named Isaac who's being sent out to investigate a ship that sent out a distress signal. However, during the boarding process, something goes awry and our ship is absolutely fucked. Just a few minutes later, we get introduced to the fact that everything is wrong on the ship and we walked into a ship in quarantine. The mining ship called the Ishimura has been infected with creatures called necromorphs, resurrected human corpses that are extremely grotesque and aggressive. Most people would probably think that shooting the head is the obvious critical spot, which makes a lot of sense. But in a very interesting design choice, the game forces you to learn that the only way to kill them is by dismembering them. Shooting a necromorph in the head only pisses it off more, making it about twice as hard to kill. Another very important distinction from other horror games is that this game is almost fully intended for you to kill everything you come across since it rewards you with more ammo. You're also armed to the fucking max throughout the game with all sorts of options. Your default pistol, an assault rifle, a heavy damage mine launcher, a flamethrower, that's just to name a few that you're gonna find on the opening levels. The only thing that stops this game from becoming an action sci-fi shooter is the phenomenal level design and the tension that you can cut with a fucking knife. Many of the areas you'll need to progress through are often quite cramped for the player. However, the necromorphs will often either play dead on the ground or sit in vents and wait for you to walk by before ambushing you, which is made much scarier by how hard it is to retreat. Another key component to the game's tense atmosphere is the flawless sound design. The sound design in this game is easily one of its best aspects and honestly my favorite part of the whole game. Another thing I have to praise this game for is the innovative and unorthodox HUD system it comes up with. For starters, instead of a traditional health bar, the colored spine on Isaac's back represents the HP that drains when we eventually get damaged. The amount of segments on Isaac's spine changes with each health upgrade, making it very easy to understand. This game nailed immersion, and all the futuristic tech is used to only further this. The game's exploration of the necromorph's origin and the sort of widespread mental illness it caused is absolutely fascinating, and I won't spoil it because the story gets a little predictable, but the whole marker thing is fucking awesome. But the worst part of the game's story is that it constantly reminds me that Dead Space 3 exists and killed the entire series, making this completely pointless. The Evil Within. Easily the most divisive game on this list, with quite a few people finding this game to just sort of be mediocre as a whole, but in terms of critical acclaim, this game technically cracks the top 10. The Evil Within follows a detective in the fictional Crimson City, as we investigate a horrible mass murder in a mental hospital, leading our cast to encounter a cloaked individual. This leads us being transported to the hellish version of the world that the majority of the game is set in. Gameplay-wise, the closest game I can sort of compare this to is probably The Last of Us, in that it's a third-person shooter with a ton of stealth elements that make you pay attention to your surroundings while also managing your very limited resources. But in terms of story and atmosphere, this game is actually pretty fucking good. The game goes the Silent Hill route of explaining your surroundings and existence through psychology as opposed to a generic breakout, and this game is much less subtle about playing into horror tropes like nobody's business. I actually had a little fun going in with a little bingo card full of all the predictable ass scares and gimmicks. There are several times where the game will finally get its rhythm going and then start to finally build up, and then there's a huge action sequence, which is always followed with like 10 minutes of nothing happening. It's not even like they use this time to, say, build character development, which I'm gonna bring up now. Castellanos as a character just doesn't change from start to finish. He as a protagonist completely fails in my opinion. And the game's opening teases you about so many different avenues they could have gone down to make this amazing. Our partner Oda and Castellanos seem like they'd probably have a very unique dynamic considering how differently they act and dress, but nope, he's just kind of there once in a while. No emotional bond or anything, nothing at all. The point I'm getting at here is that the game story in terms of its premise is super cool, but in terms of how our characters are involved in it, I just don't fucking care because no effort was put into making them interesting. I've been told that the sequel fixes a lot of these issues with the first game's story as well as offering a better array of characters, but that does not excuse this. I'm gonna be honest and just outright say it, I do not like this game very much. I find it to be a very generic hybrid of a lot of things that other games just did better. And at the end of the day, in a game that has a lot of character-focused cutscenes, having boring characters fucking sinks the game. I'm sorry if you're a fan of this game, but I'm not, and I won't be playing the sequel even if it fixes everything. This game is wildly overrated. Moving on. Out of all the games I played, Amnesia Dark Descent was by far the one I had the lowest expectations for. Released in 2010, the first installment of the Amnesia franchise is one of the most stellar but mentally damaging experiences I've ever had. I've mentioned several aspects of horror throughout this video, but the game's usage of psychological horror is almost unparalleled. As the title might allude to, we play as a character who has a severe case of amnesia and we awaken a castle in Prussia, which for the uneducated was Germany before they lost World War I and got rebranded. In most fiction, nothing ever goes well in vacant castles, and this is no different. We play as a man named Daniel, who's seeking answers about his apparent amnesia, which are revealed to us in the form of letters written by ourselves in the past. From a storytelling perspective, this is a fantastic way to leave Daniel as a character quite blank, since he's just as curious about himself as we are, which gets me into the game's strongest point, which is immersion. The game gives you a very detailed and honestly unique message upon launching it, telling you that to play this game optimally, you need to play it at night with the lights out and with a good pair of headphones, and if you've decided to do this game is fucking magic. Just like Silent Hill 2, the main appeal really isn't the gameplay or the way you're interacting with the world, but an interesting test of your confidence and ability to leave yourself in the dark where the game tries to fuck with you. When in a somewhat lit environment, everything seems stable, but the second you're in a dark room, the game's most prominent mechanic, which is your character's sanity level, tends to drop. This leads to a variety of changes, from extremely unsettling sounds around you to hallucinations or just your character having a stroke and falling over. This makes you very, very aware of how much time you're in a dark space for. There are ways to go and deal with dark spaces though. Either a tinderbox that allows you to light things like candles and torches, or through a lantern that has a limited supply of oil that you have on hand. While the benefits to the visibility are handy, this is mainly just to stop you from losing your shit every 10 seconds. Of course, as per most horror games, there are enemies here to keep you on your toes, but Amnesia keeps them more sparse than any other game here, probably taking over an hour before the first enemy makes his appearance. And it might sound kind of weird, but I don't really find the enemies to be all that scary. I know people find the grunts to be a pillar of scary enemies, but you can just outrun them, and let's be honest, these motherfuckers look goofy as hell. However, the element that makes enemies threatening in my opinion is the extremely unique way you have to open the doors in the game. Just clicking on the door itself does absolutely nothing, but by holding left click, this will allow you to swing the door by moving your mouse in either direction. Of course, the direction you swing your mouse depends on the side of the door you're on, which means when you're running from an enemy, you better hope you remember how to open that door in front of you, or else you're going to be sitting there awkwardly fumbling. Story-wise though, Daniel finds a letter written to himself by his past self revealing a ton of crucial information. Firstly, he acknowledges that we've forgotten everything, meaning that this was no accident and for some unknown reason, past Daniel fully prepared for this amnesia. And then secondly, he gives us a task, to kill some dude named Alexanderson in the inner chambers, so we set off on our journey through the castle. This game also has by far the most indirect antagonist I've ever seen in a game, not being a single entity or monster, but just a shadow that's hunting you down and spreading its corruption. Once again, this is for unknown reasons to you at this point, but regardless, this game's antagonist is just evil incarnate, which to say the least is somewhat unsettling. The shadow that's hunting you not so subtly reminds you it's there, either by collapsing structures around you or by manifesting some sort of red flesh wall. But the one area I actually have a few gripes with this game come from the weirdly unintuitive puzzles, which more than anything else just feel janky. The first main puzzle you'll come across involves creating an acid solution you'll need to progress into the second main act of the game. The game gives you a list of 4 ingredients and a basic idea of where each of them are. Finding them is where things get a little tricky. Most of these items don't have a specific model, meaning in a room full of a bunch of shit, you're just sifting through a ton of items before you stumble onto them. But something that really irritated me was how you make the acid solution. You need to select the item from your inventory and place each chemical into its vat individually, and then proceed to manually spin the 5 separate wheels with your mouse. And then the spout outputs the chemicals and tells you that there needs to be a collection device underneath. Makes sense, right? Well, then you think, yeah, that's probably what the chemical urn in your inventory is for, so you equip it and you try and place it and it doesn't work, which unequips it, so you go and re-equip it and you try and attach it to the nozzle, which doesn't work, so you're maybe like, okay, maybe this isn't the right storage method. So you scour the room looking for one, which you won't find because it is the chemical urn that you need to use. But the button to place it on the table under the spout is to click the large thing that is about a foot to the left of it. It's so stupid. And then after that, you need to spin all of the wheels manually on your own again. This drove me fucking insane. And the reason my footage doesn't actually show me succeeding at this is because I paused my recording to save some storage space, and I was fucking stunned this worked. The acid burdens down the weird flesh wall and allows us to progress into the hellish flooded hall where essentially an invisible alligator hunts you down. This is essentially a dope ass game of the floor is lava, where there are these gates where you need to activate with a time lever and parkour your way across. It's super dope. I'm not going to elaborate on the later stuff in the game since this is an absolute must play for horror fans or fans of any genre, to be honest. And while it's somewhat dated by today's standards, the psychological warfare the game throws at you is something that I don't think can be matched. Resident Evil 7, arguably the biggest reboot the series has ever seen. Some people love it and others really aren't as fond of the many various changes. For starters, this shit is not third person anymore, which I can't even imagine how hard it was to pitch that to Capcom executives. But the obvious question I'm going to get is, where is Resident Evil 4, which is mostly considered the best game in the whole franchise? Well, I'm going to be a little contrarian and say that I'm not crazy over RE4. I mean, I enjoyed the game, but in terms of being a horror game as opposed to an action adventure, I just don't think RE4 is quite as good. Admittedly, Resident Evil 7 is probably one of the games that jump scared me the most and made me even dread dread walking forward. I actually considered including Resident Evil 2's remaster here as opposed to 7, but I think that game is much less horror focused, and to be completely honest with you, I do kind of want to talk about the game very briefly. If you want to shit yourself with that game, download the first person mod for that game and just play through it. It makes an already stressful experience actually frightening at some points, but there's a few reasons I didn't put it on here. Firstly, the game sort of drifts away from horror at certain points. Mr. X in this game is just kinda goofy looking, to be honest with you. Leon is quippy as per usual, and the game strays pretty far from reality. Ada uses a manual transmission vehicle here, revealing that women in the Resident Evil world can drive. Like, okay dude, whatever you say. Another reason I didn't put this game on here isn't really its fault, but it's the abomination that was the Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City movie. Did anyone else see this when it came out? This shit looked like it would be so good. Just for it to cut 90% of the interesting plot both from 1 and 2, including Mr. X, Marvin, 90% of the G transformations, and on top of that, the final G appearance looked like a fucking failed abortion, which is a description that also aptly fits this version of Leon too. I probably could have left that out. Resident Evil 7 takes place in the deep south of Louisiana, which is the perfect setting for a horror story considering the region's association with magic and also its ruralness. And just look at this art direction. Any fans of horror should immediately start connecting some dots here. Seemingly vacant rural southern house, lots of bright sunny cinematic shots. This is clearly inspired by Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the game has no shame hiding the inspiration. We play as the entirely uninteresting Ethan Winters as we look for a wife who managed to send us an email after being dead for 3 years, leading us to find our family house and naturally break in like any rational individual. And just look at the environment here. The moody lighting is done perfectly, there's nothing around you that's directly threatening, but the game has more than alerted you to the presence of others. After finding a clearly frantic Mia, it's clear that she's infected and very unwell, making her the game's first boss fight, and more importantly, leading to maybe the game's most iconic scene. The family scene that introduces us to all of our main antagonists is probably one of my favorite scenes in any horror game ever, clearly being a recreation of the original dinner scene in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This scene brings up so many interesting questions. What the fuck is wrong with all of these people? What exactly is on the dinner table? And why do they think I'm a part of their family? All of which get answered, but in the moment, you're just focused on getting the fuck out. From here, it's essentially the typical Resident Evil formula, but from the first-person perspective. Instead of a classic tyrant chasing you, it's a very upset-looking redneck with a shovel. The puzzles really aren't on the same level as any of the other Resident Evil games, but they are unique, especially these shadow puzzles. The game is composed of a few major locations: the main Baker house, the old Baker's house, the test area, and then later the wrecked ship. Each location is where you're going to face off against one of the core members of the Baker family, each representing a very different style of horror. Jack is the classic slasher villain. Margaret represents grotesque body horror with her unsettling mutated limbs. Lucas represents psychological warfare with traps from the Saw franchise, and then later into the game, Evelyn pulls inspiration from paranormal thrillers. This diversity in horror elements and killers makes any fan of the genre content, and you will never get bored with your enemies. That is, the boss enemies. The fodder enemies, however, are potentially the most boring out of any Resident Evil game I have ever played, which is less than half. When you're not dealing with deranged rednecks, you're fighting molded. Molded are normal people who have been infected with mold that's not infected the Bakers fully, not really sure why, but who cares? Molded are effectively zombies in this game, but they tend to be tankier than the traditional zombie and are intended to be taken out in one encounter or completely ignored. There are a few variants of these, but they honestly all feel the same to me. RE2 Remaster has 6 distinct, varied types of enemies that require different approaches. This, in comparison, feels quite lackluster. Resident Evil 7 essentially takes bits and pieces from different games alongside making it first person to make it one of the most rounded Resident Evil games ever. It sort of encapsulates the whole jack of all trades, master of none saying. While it has puzzles reminiscent of the remaster of Resident Evil 1, bosses similar to 4, and monster-like characters that hunt you around the houses like Resident Evil 2 and 3, none of these are the best in the series. However, strictly as a horror game, I can't really think of a massive con this game has. It does everything to appeal to both casual horror enjoyers and the people who pick up on each and every piece of inspiration the game takes from iconic films, making it certainly one of the best horror games ever made.
Wow. Wow. You will not believe the immediate ecstasy I felt. A sacred moment. Some say one of the most important moments in a man's life, when he finishes the last bite of the Travis Scott Quarter Pounder.
Fatal Frame 2, The Crimson Butterfly. Probably the most bizarrely structured horror game on here that I seriously had no idea what I was walking into the entire time. Fatal Frame 2 has multiple unique distinctions from anything else on this entire list. First and foremost, you play as who's tailed by her identical twin Mayu, and I guess I don't really have to mention that this game is set in a somewhat modern Japanese village. This, for the most part, is a paranormal game as we investigate the clearly ghost-possessed village. The game itself does a pretty mediocre job hooking you into it, so let me pitch this game to you instead. Mayu chases a crimson butterfly into the woods, which leads her to a village which the game does everything in its power to signify it's cursed. The village is trapped in a perpetual night and it's haunted by vengeful spirits because of a failed crimson ritual that must be fulfilled. That's all you need to know. If you're the type of person who likes The Exorcist or generic paranormal horror movies, this is the game for you. However, this game does give you the ability to fight back against the ghosts with the camera. Pretty unique, I guess. This might sound weird, but the camera mechanic is actually one of the strongest components in the entire game. It does a variety of things. First, it locks you in place, making you feel immobile and unable to run. The second is that it takes the fixed camera angle from the classic Resident Evil series and shifts it to first person as you look around through the lens of a camera like it's the fucking Blair Witch Trials. The game takes full advantage of this and allows enemies to play with your peripheral vision and jump scare you perfectly. I was very skeptical of this mechanic at first because the movement in this game is slow and extremely clunky, but here I think it's somewhat tolerable since unlike the Resident Evil games, exploration isn't benefited by just running through everything. As per usual, you all know the deal. I'm not going to go super far into the story because this is honestly super depressing. The game goes very deep into the idea of sororal bonds and has a ton of Japanese folklore and an extremely tense atmosphere that it uses to its advantage perfectly. The one thing I will consistently knock this game for are its visuals. I know a lot of people don't find these criticisms valid since at the time it was probably par for the course, but generally the more the game tries to push the boundaries of its visuals, the less can be done with it in terms of upscaling. Like take the pre-rendered cutscenes in a lot of different games. Back when they were released, these were easily the best and most visually impressive asset. Now they're easily the worst looking thing in the game since we can't modify them in the in-game engine. This game just doesn't look good today, and while I guess it adds to the tense atmosphere, it's in desperate need of a remake. Overall, this game is fucking phenomenal, but not flawless. It's certainly the best paranormal horror game ever made and a great experience, but if you're someone who's super picky about visuals and controls, maybe just watch a playthrough of this game instead. Well, everybody, that about does it. My horror quota for the year is now over, and I am not going to miss it. I love some of these games, but I'm just not the type of guy who can play these games year-round. I prefer a lot of other types of games, to be honest. But before I wrap everything up, I want to answer the simple question posed at the beginning of the video. What is it that makes a horror game great? Well, I found a correlation of 5 components that need to be checked off. The first is an iconic villain. Horror villains are always the main staple of the franchise, whether it be Myers or Leatherface or Xenomorph, you get the idea. The best horror games have characters like Pyramid Head, Mr. X, the Baker family, and also the Xenomorph, actually. Next is a coherent story and a solid protagonist. As opposed to horror films where the protagonist is usually a useless teenager, in horror games the protagonist needs to be just as captivating. Characters like Ripley, Ethan, or Daniel rarely have their faces shown yet are interesting enough to keep the player going. The next thing is atmosphere, which can be a bit hard to nail down. I think a lot of it is lighting, sound design, and general presentation. Something like Amnesia, Fatal Frame 2, and Resident Evil 7 absolutely nail. The most subjective quality I would say is that the games need a clear subgenre to fit into. Many of these games of course pull inspiration from several subgenres, but the gameplay itself needs to have clear identity, whether it be primarily stealth or combat against your many creepy enemies. And then finally, the trickiest thing to nail is the perfect amount of tension for the game's specific purpose. Games like Dead Space utilize tension to keep players on their toes and unsettled by the knowledge of upcoming necromorphs in the game, while other games like Fatal Frame use it more subtly to keep players on edge knowing that they aren't alone. Both games achieve this differently, but they use it to their advantage regardless. There are only a few games that achieve all 5 of these properties, and you know what, fuck it, I'm just gonna rank every game. At number 1, I'm throwing Silent Hill 2. This game has Pyramid Head, who's an iconic villain, a fantastic story, a chilling atmosphere, and all the tension in the world. At 2, I'll say Alien Isolation, which honestly almost does everything flawlessly, but the alien really isn't an original character and has the benefit of going in with a pre-made franchise, which is really my only justification for not putting it over Silent Hill. For number 3, I'm gonna have to give it to Amnesia Dark Descent for the best atmosphere in any horror game I've ever played. Despite not really having the best villains, it makes up for it with a cryptic story and tension. At 4, I got Resident Evil 1 Remastered, which does everything but story so perfectly it's insane. The annoying movement and combat makes the tension well done, and the mansion's atmosphere is something that games have tried to replicate for fucking decades. Number 5 goes to System Shock 2, another game that I think has a weaker villain, but the way that the story gets told is captivating, and its tension and atmosphere are once again on a different level. Number 6 goes to Dead Space, a game I spoke pretty highly of, but admittedly it's not really my forte when it comes to horror games and movies in general. The game mastered the idea of tension in an action setting, but I'm just not crazy about how the story is told. Number 7 goes to RE7 due to the vast amount of variety from the horror space, and the villains that are diverse enough to cover a majority of common fears seen in horror. The game also does a great job with atmosphere, and the story is well above average. The one thing I will knock the game for though is the lack of a good overarching villain. Number 8 goes to Fatal Flaw 2 for the elite story in almost every single game element, adding to the tension of running into a ghost. The atmosphere is also nearly perfect, with my only complaint being the data graphics and control scheme. Number 9 is going to be Luigi's Mansion, which I probably shouldn't have even included, to be honest, but for a kid's horror game, it does a lot of things right without necessarily overdoing it and still has a solid vibe to it. And then finally at 10, I'm throwing Evil Within. I'm just not a fan of this game as a whole, but remember, number 10 on the list of greatest horror games ever is still a hell of a fucking compliment. Well everyone, that's going to do it for me. I hope you enjoyed this Halloween special. This was a lot of fun to make. I have no idea what's going to be up and coming on my next videos, but I'm sure I'll think of something. Actually, if there's a specific topic or genre you want want to suggest, please leave me a comment, or if you disagree with anything I said, also leave me a comment and tell me how much of a moron I am. Hey everybody, Dagger from the future here once again, and I realized in my outro I did not mention that the next video might be delayed pretty bad. This has been a really rough month for me. I have surgery coming up, like, I'm pretty sure tomorrow, actually. By the time this video comes out, I will probably be under. It's nothing particularly serious, there's no real need to worry or anything. It's just that the next video is probably going to be delayed because I have no idea how this is going to affect me and my work ethic and ability to focus. Plus I have like 3 college essays due right after, so it's going to be a shit show for me. But I figured the least I could do is do a little mini Q&A in the comment section, and then potentially start a new thing at the end of every episode where I just kind of go through your questions and answer them and make it a little bit, I don't know. But yeah, like my previous self said, any and all support would be amazing, especially in this time, and I will see you all in the next one.